Honors Chemistry students. Today I'm going to do the Can You Make 2 grams of a precipitate lab for you since we're on virtual learning this week. So you need to have done the pre-lab questions and calculations and submit those along with the rest of your pre-lab. Then I'm going to go through and do the procedure with 2 different salts. So the first salt here on the left is sodium carbonate. Now I'm not going to tell you how much sodium carbonate I weighed out, but I weighed out enough that should, in theory, make 2 grams of a precipitate. So I'm going to add that to this first beaker here. And then my other reactant is zinc sulfate heptahydrate. And again, I'm not going to tell you how much I weighed out, but I weighed out the correct amount that, again, should, when we combine these 2 together, the goal is to make 2 grams of a precipitate. So part of your post-lab work is to determine how much of each of those reactants I measured out. So to get them to react, first I'm going to dissolve them in water. And so I'm going to add 25 milliliters of distilled water to each of the beakers. And we'll get those all okay. So put that one to the sodium carbonate. And for the zinc sulfate heptahydrate, and need to stir them around so that they dissolve. I don't want to mix them together until they have completely dissolved. Some dissolve a little faster than others. Kind of a pain. We're getting there though. We're almost. It's almost all dissolved. Almost just a couple little chunks left. Break them up. Okay, that's pretty good. Then I'm going to do the same thing with the zinc sulfate heptahydrate. And again, the hydrates. Now this one, with this combination of these 2 reactants, only the zinc sulfate is a hydrate, heptahydrate. So again, as you read through the background information, the hydrates will make, when we can react them, we're just doing a double replacement reaction where one of the products is going to be a precipitate, but this will also have a third product of the water. So the total number of waters here, we don't have any waters, but with the zinc sulfate heptahydrate, I'll let you figure out how many waters that is. That's our third product. So we'll make 2 salts, 1 aqueous, 1 a precipitate, and then the third product is water. So make sure, again, in your post-lab, you're writing out and balancing that reaction. Okay, that's pretty good. I mean, it's not perfect. There's a few little pieces that haven't dissolved, but for the most part, this one has dissolved. Okay, so now that I've got those pretty much dissolved, I'm going to mix them together. And you can see pretty much right away, I'm going to try and get as much of this in the beaker as possible. Almost immediately, as soon as we mix that together, it formed a precipitate. You can see kind of a white, kind of gelish-like precipitate. And I'm going to stir it around just to mix it up even better. Make sure we get as much of the two reactants reacting with each other. Looks pretty good. And it's okay to add some extra water. I'm just going to clean off my stirring rod because, again, we're trying to make exactly 2 grams, so I don't want to leave any extra precipitate on my stirring rod. Okay, so now that we've got our precipitate made, before we filter it with the filter paper, I'm going to weigh the filter paper. So let's go over to the scale so you can record the filter paper, because after this is all weighed and, oops, wait a minute, hang on, and dried, we'll weigh the filter paper with the precipitate on it, and so we'll need to be able to subtract out the filter paper. Okay, so there's the mass of our filter paper. I'd call that 1.145. That's good enough. Let's put you back here. Okay. So, to get the filter paper ready to filter, I'm folding it in half and folding it in half again, opening it up so I make a closed little snow cone like thing. Put it down here in the filter, in the funnel, and then I'm going to start filtering my precipitate. I want to make sure I don't go over the edges at all, so I'm going to go kind of slow. Water will slowly drip out. I just want to make sure I'm not overflowing my filter paper. So I'll add more as, so you can see here, we're getting, this is called the filtrate, the clear stuff. That's our water along with the salt, the other, the aqueous salt, the other product that was made from this reaction. So both of those are dripping through, and then the filter paper is just catching the solid precipitate. While we're waiting on that to filter through, I'll show you kind of what the top of the, so you can see we're almost up to the rim of the filter paper, which I don't want to overflow that. So we'll let this drip, let it go down a little bit before I add the remaining amount of precipitate, but I want to get as much of that precipitate out of the beaker and into the funnel as possible. So you can see it's still dripping. Clean up, waiting on that. A little bit more. I want to try and scoop as much of this out of the beaker as possible and into the funnel paper, the filter paper. And again, we can add extra water, that's okay. So I'm going to rinse my stirring rod off in here to get all the excess. You can see that it's going a little faster now with the extra water. Same thing with my beaker. I'm going to kind of rinse the sides off the beaker. Make sure you can see that. Yep. Okay. So I'm washing as much of my precipitate into into my filter paper. And of course, it's not going to be perfect. There is going to be still some precipitate left in the beaker. So on the errors question, where, you know, even if this does end up being exactly 2 grams after it's dried, there's still errors being made. You know, I didn't necessarily dissolve every little teeny tiny bit of the reactants before I mixed them together. Even though I mixed them pretty well, there may have been, you know, some reactants that didn't quite mix and form precipitate. There's still probably some precipitate left in here and here. So those are all things that come into play for the air. So I'll let that keep dripping. Get as much of the, that's the other thing, I want to get as much of the aqueous salt and the water out of the filter paper so that we're not drying and weighing that as well. That's something else. The other salt, now the water will evaporate in the oven when it's drying, but if we have any of the other aqueous salt in there, we stick that in the oven, that's going to become a solid, and that would contribute to air as well. So we'll let that keep going till it's pretty much no longer dripping. You can kind of see again, here's it's kind of caving in. It almost looks like a oh crap, what are those called? Sinkhole. The way it's caving in as the aqueous substances are filtering out. It's starting to slow a little bit, so we'll wait till the drips completely stop for the most part. Alright, drips are getting slower and slower, but it is still dripping, so we'll let that go a little bit longer before we transfer it onto our watch glass and put it in the oven to dry overnight. Now, if we were doing this in class, each group would have a different pair of reactants. But again, in this case, everybody's having the same pair. And, you know, while you're waiting on this to finish dripping, you could be working out your calculations. Again, you're first determining how much of each of the reactants I used. That will give us, form 2.0 grams of the precipitate. You also have to figure out which product is the precipitate and make sure you have a balanced chemical reaction. And just work through those questions on the worksheet, but you know, you're doing that on your own piece of paper, because in the end you're going to be turning in a post lab on this, and our drips are really slowing down now. Really slowing down. Still have a few. So you can see we've got an even bigger sinkhole going on here as more of the aqueous salt and water drip through down into our beaker. We've got a decent amount of aqueous solution down there. There goes another drip. So on these calculations, you're basically working backwards from once you figure out which product is the precipitate, work your way backwards from 2 grams of the precipitate to grams of each reactant, and that'll tell you how much I weighed out. And remember to carry your molar masses to the tenths of a gram, and then your masses of your reactants should also go to the tenths. Oh, the drops are so slow now. Let's let this one last drop go, and then I think we'll call it quits. But again, I'm not the most patient person, so we'll stop after this drop goes. And again, in your errors, there could still be some water and some aqueous salt still in here. Oh, there goes a couple drips off of the filter paper. Again, the water will evaporate, but the aqueous salt will solidify. So let's get as many of those drops off of the filter paper as possible. It's really dripping. The good thing is, though, is that the filtrate, for the most part, is pretty clear, which tells us that we kept the majority of the precipitate in the filter paper. A lot of times you'll get a pretty cloudy filtrate. I mean, it is a little cloudy, but not too bad. And that just means that some of the precipitate slipped through the filter paper. And then again, that would be another error. So I'd say that's pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and hopefully that's just water. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put this on, so I got our precipitate here, put this on our watch glass, and then we'll take it over to the oven, and we'll let it dry. So come over here. So here's the oven. We'll just put it in here, and then if I can get it turned on, maybe. There we go. Okay, so oven's on. We'll let that stay in there till it dries, and then the next video will be us taking out the precipitate and weighing it and see if we did in fact make 2 grams of a precipitate. So see you in a little bit.